Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we sift through the noise to bring you the clearest, most surprising insights from the stack of sources you need to be truly well-informed. Today we're plunging into a topic that, well, it defines so much of our lives, yet it remains surprisingly elusive. Education. I mean, think about it. It's this massive global enterprise, right? Constantly demanding more funding, more qualifications, more programs. But have we ever truly stopped to ask, what is education, really?
It's such a fundamental question, isn't it? We use the word education all the time, almost instinctively, but our actual grasp of it can be, well, all over the place. Is learning to bake that perfect souffle education in the same way that grappling with ancient Greek philosophy is? If we can't even agree on that basic definition, how on earth can we measure success or, craft effective policies?
Exactly. So our mission today is to really embark on a deep dive into the philosophy of education itself. We're going to try and unearth what truly makes a person educated, how that differs from all the other, vital things that happen in schools, and critically, what hidden assumptions often underpin our everyday ideas about teaching and learning.
Yeah, and what's so interesting here is that this isn't some new problem. Philosophical inquiry into concepts like education, well, it's timeless, really. And like a detective piecing together clues, to solve a complex case, our deep dive material serves as our guide. Our aim isn't, and never is, to tell you what to think. It's more about equipping you with, let's say, robust tools to think more clearly, more insightfully about these foundational questions yourself.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this, and maybe the first step is a really crucial distinction. We often use the term educational system very broadly, right, to cover pretty much anything you experience, hear, or read. So learning to rebuild an engine or diving into ancient Roman history, it all kind of falls under that big system umbrella. What's striking from our sources, though, is that this broad concept is actually value-free. It's just descriptive.
Precisely. It's a neutral label, essentially. But when we talk about education itself, that's different. This is what philosophers call a normative term. And let's just pause on normative for a sec because it's really key. It means that, by definition, true education is inherently a good thing. It implies something worthwhile has been transmitted and, importantly, in a morally acceptable way. You couldn't logically say, he was educated, but it didn't improve him at all. The two ideas are just linked.
That's a really powerful distinction. Okay, so if the educational system is that broad, value-free thing, what are schools actually for beyond this pure normative sense of education? The material makes it clear that schools do lots of vital things that often get mixed up with, or even mistakenly called, education. I mean, think about it. They provide essential childcare. That's a huge societal benefit right there. They also offer training.
And if we dig into training a bit, it means acquiring specific practical skills, like learning how to use the library's cataloging system, maybe,
Yeah.
or how to write legibly. These are definitely valuable, maybe even necessary functions of schooling, but they're quite distinct from education in that deeper, transformative sense. And of course, schools play this enormous role in socialization, helping kids integrate into cultural norms, expectations.
Which naturally leads us to think about what isn't education. And our sources are incredibly clear on this. Certain practices are just inherently objectionable. They're actually antithetical to true education. We're talking about things like conditioning or indoctrinating, deliberately closing a mind to other ideas. These are practices that actively work against the very aims of genuine education.
Right. And this brings up a really fundamental question. If training, childcare, socialization, if all that can happen informally, through families, communities, maybe even self-study, what's the core justification for having a free state schooling system? Well, the deep dive material makes a pretty compelling case for a practical reason. It's just much simpler for parents to teach basic life skills or socialize their kids than it is to help them grasp really complex, abstract bodies of thought. Think about the intricacies of history or advanced literature or the scientific method. Most people, frankly, won't make significant progress there without some kind of structured, expert guidance.
And here's an insight about teachers that might surprise you. To be a truly good teacher, our sources argue, you don't just need training in techniques, classroom management, how to project your voice. You fundamentally need to be educated yourself, especially in the very subjects you teach.
Yeah, it's almost scandalous, they suggest, that in many systems, you have people teaching subjects they've never really studied adequately or truly mastered themselves.
Okay, let's pivot a bit now. What makes us humans uniquely capable of learning in this educated sense? We often hear Aristotle's definition, right? Humans as rational animals. But this isn't just about abstract thought in some ivory tower. Our deep dive material expands on this. It's about our distinct ability to act purposively, to plan ahead, choose our own goals, and to actively control our environment rather than just, instinctively responding to stimuli like other animals might.
And what's so profound here, I think, is how deeply this capacity is woven into our language abilities. Unlike any other species we know of, humans alone possess this distinct kind of language, what the material calls a hypothesizing language. This is what allows us to imagine, to predict, to formulate propositions that can be true or false, and yes, even provocatively, to lie. This unique capacity to construct and evaluate possibilities is, according to these sources, right at the very core of our ability to be educated.
So if you ever found, I don't know, an animal or some super advanced AI that could genuinely think, hey, you promised to take me for a walk and you broke your promise, or maybe I'm so tired of this calculation, I'm going to take a break, then strictly speaking, they need to go to school. It's that hypothesizing language capacity that makes us truly educable.
Yeah, exactly. And this also brings us right into that whole nature versus nurture debate. Our individual identity, it's clearly shaped by both our genes, our inherent potentials, tendencies, and our experiences. But crucially, our minds gift us with what's called autonomy. Now, this isn't just freedom like doing whatever you feel like. It means self-governance or self-direction through our own reasoning, as opposed to just being driven by external factors or, basic impulses. We exercise control over circumstances rather than just being passive responders.
Okay, this leads to a really crucial question about how we should set up schools. Should there be, like, a common system for all children, regardless of their diverse backgrounds? Our deep dive material suggests that while differences absolutely need to be understood and respected, a common schooling system can actually foster a vital sense of shared identity, a common language. I mean, think about it. If you want a cohesive society, bringing everyone together through shared intellectual experiences seems pretty key, right?
It does. What's quite illuminating, though, is a provocative point the material raises. That social concerns often seem to overshadow purely educational concerns when we design schools. While schools rightly serve critical social functions like socialization, their distinctive feature, their primary unique contribution, is providing education. The argument presented is that schools shouldn't be primarily set up to directly fix all of society's problems. Arguably, they aren't even equipped to do that effectively. The core focus, the material contends, really ought to remain on providing the best possible education for every individual.
All right, let's shake things up a bit. Let's challenge some deeply ingrained assumptions in how we approach education. You've probably heard ideas like natural education or even deschooling. Pretty radical stuff, eh? Take Jean-Jacques Rousseau back in the 18th century. His idea of natural education for a child like Emile. Well, the kid would learn purely by consequence. No formal lessons, no books until much later. You break a window, you freeze from the cold. That's your lesson. Pretty impactful.
And that idea, it really resonated, again, powerfully in the 20th century. Ivan Illich, for example, argued quite compellingly in his book Deschooling Society that institutional schooling itself is fundamentally incompatible with true education. He believed formal schools basically indoctrinate and stifle independent thought. He advocated instead for informal, self-directed learning networks.
And a cornerstone of that deschooling critique is this concept of the hidden curriculum. The idea is that beyond, math and history on the timetable, schools implicitly teach things like deference to authority and an ingrained belief that real expertise mainly resides in professional groups. It's about learning values and assumptions that are never really spelled out.
Right. Now, let's turn that critical lens onto some common slogans we hear all the time in education. Ideas like making sure the curriculum is relevant, or that children are ready for certain material. I mean, on the surface, who could argue with that? Sounds perfectly reasonable. But our deep dive material points out these are often just vague slogans. They offer very little practical guidance for actual policy. For instance, kids might be ready for lots of things at a certain age, but readiness alone doesn't tell us which specific worthwhile activity we should encourage.
Or take discovery learning, that popular idea that kids should figure things out for themselves, rather than just being told. Now, it can be a really effective technique for some students in some contexts, but it's certainly not some universal fix. And it doesn't automatically mean a child will develop these broad, generic problem-solving skills that magically transfer across totally different fields. From advanced math to, say, political analysis. They're still guided, aren't they? And the skill is drawing conclusions from selected data.
Exactly. And this leads us to take a critical look at basing the curriculum on children's needs or interests. First off, are needs always obvious? Not really. Someone might genuinely think they need cosmetic surgery, but be quite mistaken about its true value to them. And more critically, is fulfilling a need always desirable? I mean, a murderer might need the means to commit a crime, but we'd obviously never want to satisfy that need.
And as for interests, well, we absolutely have to distinguish between what actually interests a child right now and what is truly in their interest for their long-term development. A teacher's role isn't just to follow along with existing interests, is it? It's to actively promote interest in worthwhile areas. Otherwise, we might just end up endlessly exploring a child's current, maybe limited, experiences without ever really broadening their horizons into these rich areas they likely never encounter on their own. Okay, so if we're moving beyond these buzzwords and vague slogans, what actually defines a truly educated person? Our deep dive material leans heavily on the philosopher Richard Peters' influential criteria. First, and maybe most broadly, is breadth of knowledge. It's not about narrow specialization. Think of someone like Albert Einstein. Brilliant physicist, obviously, but he was also deeply musical, historically aware, had a profound moral compass. Contrast that with, say, Mozart. Unparalleled musical genius, no question. But was he broadly educated in that same encompassing sense? Maybe not. Or think of a brilliant race car driver. Exceptional skill, yes, but they aren't inherently well educated, if that's the sole extent of their deep understanding.
That's a crucial distinction, yeah. Second, Peters' criteria really emphasize transformative understanding. Knowledge shouldn't just be like collecting facts in a bucket. It should genuinely change your perspective, your whole way of viewing the world. It should, in a very real sense, make you a better, more insightful person.
Then there's this criterion of caring or commitment. An educated person isn't just someone who has knowledge. They care deeply about the inherent standards, the rigorous procedures within a subject. What counts as legitimate evidence in science? What makes a cogent argument in philosophy? They're committed to upholding those internal, often demanding standards.
And finally, there's cognitive perspective. This means understanding the reason why behind things, seeing the intricate connections, grasping the underlying logic. And these criteria, they aren't just pulled out of thin air. They're assessed using what philosophers often call the 4 C's. Is an account or argument clear? Is it complete? Is it coherent? Does it hang together logically? And is it compatible with other well-established beliefs we hold? Think of it like a detective again. You need clear clues, all the pieces, they have to fit without contradiction, and they can't clash wildly with what else you know is true.
Right. And this emphasis on intrinsic value, it really challenges that idea of education being solely about utility or, economic ends. Like Herbert Spencer's view that schools should mainly prepare you to make a living. As John Adams so wisely put it, we need 2 educations. One should teach us how to make a living and the other how to live.
And that raises a really important point. While some knowledge is clearly useful for society, medicine, engineering, sure, that doesn't mean everyone needs to study it in depth. We also need to consider indirect utility. Learning poetry might not seem directly useful for a specific job, right? But it could lead to a more sensitive, empathetic outlook on life, which has its own profound kind of utility. And we absolutely have to look beyond just short-term benefits. History is full of examples of people trained meticulously for roles that just vanished by the time they finished their education.
Okay. Our sources then delve into what Paul Hirsch called forms of understanding or forms of inquiry. These are distinct, unique ways humans have developed over time to make sense of their experience. The true forms, they argue, are science, mathematics, and philosophy. Each has its own unique concepts, logical structures, and really rigorous methods for testing truth claims.
But what's truly compelling here, I think, is that while subjects like history, moral understanding, religion, and the fine arts, while they might not be forms in that same strict, definable sense, they are nonetheless identified as absolutely fundamental subjects for an educated person. Literature, for example, is described as this vast, invaluable repository of data about the human condition across time, across cultures. Engaging with it can profoundly increase our understanding, our imaginative sensitivity, in ways our own, often limited life experiences just can't match.
And crucially, how these subjects are taught matters hugely. Since many of them don't yield simple, universally proven answers, but rather, more or less plausible interpretations, they need to be taught in ways that actively encourage critical, reflective responses from students. Not just passive acceptance, it's about empowering the individual to make their own informed, reasoned judgment in the end. Okay, next up, let's dissect one of the most vital, yet often misunderstood concepts in education: indoctrination. Our deep dive material lays out 4 necessary conditions for it to actually occur. First, the content itself must be what's called a doctrinal belief.
These are propositions that basically by their very nature cannot be demonstrably proven true or false. Think of statements like God exists or maybe economic considerations are the sole determinant of social change. There's just no universally agreed upon method to verify or falsify them.
That's a really critical distinction. Consider something like metals expand when heated, or there's a planet made entirely of green cheese. These are, at least in principle, provable or falsifiable, right? Even if we don't have the evidence right now. Doctrinal beliefs, though, lack that consensus on what would even count as evidence for or against them. I mean, if nothing could, in principle, ever challenge a belief, then what kind of belief is it, really?
Second condition, there has to be an unshakable commitment. The explicit intention is to implant a closed mind, a mind unwilling to seriously consider alternative viewpoints or contrary evidence. The indoctrinated person holds a viewpoint they just will not allow themselves to question. If this wasn't necessary, well, we'd all be indoctrinated just by having a worldview, and that wouldn't be a very useful concept, would it?
No, exactly. Third, the method used is consistently non-rational persuasion. This means things like appeals to raw emotion, relentless repetition, or other tactics that deliberately bypass logical reasoning. And fourth, there must be an explicit intention by the indoctrinator to produce this unshakable belief. Regardless of what their avowed intentions, well, what they say they're doing might be, it's about what they are really trying to achieve.
This naturally leads to the question, can science itself be indoctrinated? Our deep dive material states pretty unequivocally that the very nature of scientific activity, forming hypotheses, rigorously testing them, critically rejecting them if the predictions are wrong, that process fundamentally precludes indoctrination within science itself. There's just no room for clinging to a hypothesis through thick and thin if the evidence goes against it.
However, and this is important, a science or math teacher can still indoctrinate. They can do it if they attach non-scientific doctrines to their teaching. For instance, a scientist might emphatically claim that, oh, only science is worth doing, and art subjects are a complete waste of time. Now, those are assertions that fall outside the bounds of scientific inquiry itself, and they could certainly lead to indoctrination if they're implanted uncritically.
So where does indoctrination typically lurk? Well, subjects like literature, history, civics, ethics, maybe religion, because they frequently deal with inherently contentious, value-laden subject matter. Teachers in these areas need to be especially on their guard. The nature of the subject alone doesn't automatically make it indoctrination, but it means teachers have to be acutely vigilant about their intentions and their methods.
And if we think about the broader implications here, the most potent antidote to indoctrination is simply rationality. This means teaching people to persistently ask why, to diligently seek out good reasons for their beliefs and actions, and to clearly distinguish between what counts as a relevant reason versus an irrelevant one. It's really about valuing and cultivating the very quality of thinking itself.
And there's a subtle but I think important distinction here between being unreasonable and being irrational. Irrational behavior basically lacks any good reason. Hating someone for no discernible logical basis, perhaps.
Right.
Unreasonable behavior, on the other hand, might have weak reasons. Thinking your boss hates you solely because they denied you one promotion might be unreasonable, sure, but not necessarily entirely irrational. A truly rational person is committed to giving good reasons and considering alternatives, even if they end up holding a view that seems a bit odd to others. Okay, now let's unpack a term that gets thrown around a lot in education today: skills. We're constantly hearing about critical thinking skills or social-emotional skills, but our deep dive material really challenges this labeling. Strictly speaking, a skill properly refers to a discrete, often physical, trainable ability, like juggling or carpentry or maybe mastering a specific bit of software.
Yeah, and what's insightful here is that critical thinking is just far more complex than that. It involves the sophisticated blend of knowledge, deep understanding, and a certain disposition, a willingness to be critical. To label it merely a skill wrongly implies it can be developed in isolation, like a golf swing, or that just practicing it somehow automatically leads to improvement across the board. And the same really applies to what are often called social and emotional skills, like empathy or patience. Our deep dive material argues pretty strongly these aren't skills in that sense, but rather complex characteristics or fundamental aspects of personality.
That's a crucial point. You can't just teach empathy like you teach someone to do a handstand, can you? These qualities, empathy, optimism, patience, they can and absolutely should be nurtured. How? Well, through modeling positive behavior, fostering a genuinely supportive school community, and through conceptual examination within subjects like history and literature, looking at how people behave and why.
They develop through rich, immersive experiences, not through some generic training program.
Exactly. And similarly, leadership isn't some generic skill set that applies universally. It's primarily a matter of character, and the specific qualities needed in a good leader depend entirely on the context of the organization. I mean, the ability to captain an ocean liner certainly doesn't automatically equip you to captain a rugby team effectively. This is a clear example of what our sources call the generic fallacy. Believing skills are just transferable like that.
So what does all this mean for education in practice? Where does this leave us? It seems like a clear call to action. Schools should intensely focus on teaching core subjects that provide essential knowledge and deep understanding. But, and this is the key bit, they must do so in a way that actively encourages critical appraisal. Don't just deliver the information. Explain why certain conclusions are reached. And crucially, invite students to question, explore, offer alternatives. It's all about fostering authentic intellectual engagement, not just rote learning or passive acceptance. Now, our deep dive wouldn't be complete without tackling some really thorny issues. Freedom, autonomy, and that looming challenge of relativism. First up, academic freedom. This definitely raises some potentially uncomfortable questions. Our deep dive material argues that teachers should generally be free to express unpalatable, maybe even upsetting views, if they do so in the interest of a sincere viewpoint, even if it causes discomfort for some.
And what's critical here is the distinction between feeling offended and having a good reason to be offended. Offensiveness is often subjective, isn't it? Culturally contingent. The mere fact that someone feels offended doesn't in itself mean they are right to feel that way, or, more importantly, that speech should therefore be curtailed. Restraints on free speech in educational contexts, the material suggests, can't really be justified simply by claims of subjective offense.
And this links right back to that concept of autonomy we discussed earlier. Remember, autonomy means self-direction through your own reasoning, not just impulse or reaction. Our sources challenge that idea of, say, a self-regulating baby. A true self isn't just there at birth. It develops through complex interaction with the environment and, crucially, requires developed cognitive ability to make meaningful, reasoned choices.
Right. Babies responding to hunger pangs aren't regulating their lives in an autonomous way. They're reacting to basic physiological stimuli. It's quite different, which naturally leads us to think about the limits to freedom. Our sources suggest two main criteria generally. First, not interfering with the freedom of others. Second, not harming oneself. While those sound clear enough, they get very complex in practice, don't they? What truly constitutes harm or interference? That can be debated endlessly. For instance, does a student consistently opting out of all lessons in the long run harm themselves by denying themselves an education? It's tricky.
Let's consider a historical case study mentioned, the philosopher David Hume. The University of Edinburgh recently removed his name from a tower, partly because of a footnote where he expressed a belief that Negroes are naturally inferior to whites. Our deep dive material delves into the nuances here. It defines racism quite strictly as disliking or looking down on someone purely because of their race. Merely observing perceived, and yes, possibly incorrect, inherent differences doesn't on its own automatically count as racism by that definition, even if the observation itself is empirically wrong or factually false.
It's a really important point about interpreting historical figures within their own context. Hume's view, though empirically wrong by today's standards, didn't necessarily mean he believed non-whites didn't deserve respect as persons or could be treated badly. It's complex. The material also touches on the difficult debate around unconscious racism, suggesting it's probably quite rare for someone to genuinely dislike a race without any conscious awareness of it at all. Now, these are clearly contentious areas, and our aim here is just to report the arguments neutrally, conveying the perspectives presented in the sources without taking sides or endorsing any particular view.
Okay, finally, let's confront what might be a significant challenge to reason and knowledge itself: relativism. This is the idea, basically, that there are no objective truths and everything is just a subjective viewpoint. The first and maybe most devastating flaw in this argument, as our material powerfully points out, is logical self-refutation. Think about it. If the statement, "there is no truth," is itself supposed to be true, well, then it contradicts itself.
It's a fundamental absurdity, really. It just falls apart under its own weight. And besides, our daily lives are completely predicated on the assumption that some things are objectively true. We catch the bus expecting it to arrive on time, we carefully avoid rat poison, we exercise for health benefits, all because we operate on the belief that certain things about the world are reliably true. Knowledge defined as true belief based on good reason is possible, even if it's often provisional, subject to refinement. And some truths, like those in mathematics, are pretty much logically unassailable.
And the consequences of widespread relativism, they can be quite severe. Our sources warn of a stultifying effect, leading to this kind of debilitating malaise, cynicism, maybe a retreat into pure materialism. If nobody can confidently say what's true or false, what's right or wrong, society becomes vulnerable to indoctrinated and committed believers who do passionately believe in their version of truth, potentially at great cost to everyone else.
Right. And it's objectively false, for example, to claim that ugliness is morally wrong. Morality deals with principles like honesty, integrity, justice, not aesthetics. That's a category mistake.
Okay, let's round out our discussion by looking at culture, elitism, and aesthetic value in learning. Our deep dive material clarifies a really crucial distinction here. There's culture in the anthropological sense, a broad way of life, encompassing everything from, traditional Wensleydale cheese and local dog races to social customs. But then there's culture with a capital C. That refers specifically to aesthetic high culture, those works generally considered superior art, like Shakespeare's plays or Beethoven's symphonies.
That's a really important nuance. And while cultural diversity in that anthropological sense is generally welcomed, undeniably enriching, we have to caution against the simplistic view that all cultural practices are equally admirable or acceptable. Practices like, say, slavery or honor killings are fundamentally incompatible with core values in many societies and can be legitimately condemned. Respect for persons requires neutrality towards differences, sure, but not an unconditional acceptance of fundamentally incompatible values.
Our deep dive also briefly mentions those different models of integration, like the melting pot versus the mosaic, reflecting different philosophies on how diverse cultures might coexist.
Which leads us naturally to a reevaluation of cultural elitism. The argument here isn't about social privilege or status. It's the contention that some art is inherently more valuable and genuinely requires a cultivated sensitivity, a developed understanding to fully appreciate. Elite in this context just refers to the most able or competent individuals who have developed this capacity, not necessarily the wealthy or privileged few. However, establishing objective criteria for what constitutes great art remains a profound philosophical challenge, and just relying on intuition or subjective preference is obviously problematic.
So, why then should schools bother teaching high culture? The compelling reason, our sources argue, is basically this. Popular culture is everywhere. It's ubiquitous. Kids are constantly immersed in it outside of school. But the profound potential joys, the transformative advantages of appreciating culture, those deep works that uniquely develop intellectual ability and emotional sensitivity, the intricate beauty of a Shakespeare play versus perhaps the fleeting lyrics of a pop song, those advantages will largely be denied to most young people if schools don't actively introduce them to it.
Right. And finally, let's tie all of this back to the very philosophy of teaching itself. Our deep dive material highlights a pervasive problem in a lot of educational research, a distinct lack of rigorous engagement with conceptual issues. Researchers, the material argues, frequently confuse simply defining a word with truly analyzing a complex concept, or they distort concepts like understanding by trying to define them purely behaviorally, as something you can just observe and quantify, like time on task.
Which leads to a critical question about the relationship between theory and practice in education. Is theory just ivory tower stuff? Well, our deep dive material argues passionately that philosophical thinking theory is not separate from good teaching practice. In fact, it's intimately interconnected with it. If a teacher truly rethinks the concept of indoctrination, for example, based on this deeper understanding we've discussed, their actions, their intentions in the classroom will inevitably change. Even just considering the purpose of education, why are we doing this? What does seeing children develop actually mean? That demands prior conceptual clarity before any meaningful action can even be taken.
Exactly. And what's so insightful here is that thinking deeply about the why and wherefores of their everyday classroom practices, that is, according to our sources, an essential part of what it actually means to be a good teacher in that normative sense. Theory should continually inform practice, sure, but it should also be modified by practice, fostering true adaptability and thoughtful action rather than just the rote application of generic skills pulled from empirical research findings.
Wow, what an intellectual journey we've been on. We've gone from the broad societal value placed on education to distinguishing its core normative meaning from all those other crucial functions of schooling. We've explored our unique human capacity for learning. We've boldly challenged common educational slogans. We've rigorously defined what it might mean to be an educated person, dissected the insidious dangers of indoctrination, grappled with the complexities of freedom, the persistent threat of relativism, and even debated the profound role of high culture in the curriculum.
Yeah, we've really seen firsthand how deeply our understanding of education is just inextricably linked to what we value as individuals and as a society. And philosophy, unlike maybe some sciences, doesn't always provide those neat, definitive answers, does it? But it undeniably offers profound greater understanding. It helps us formulate clearer, saner thinking about these incredibly complex, value-laden subjects.
So as you reflect on this deep dive, maybe consider this thought to take away. Given all these nuanced conceptual distinctions and perhaps surprising insights we've uncovered, what single clarity will you personally bring to your next conversation about learning, or schools, or education? And why does that particular clarity matter most to you right now?